something that's run through our course, but is on the agenda again today in our present moment, and that's the tension between work and family, sometimes also called the work-life balance. And I wanted to start by asking what exactly it is we mean when we say work-family tension or work-life balance. What are we speaking of when we talk about this issue?
Well, this is one of the most intriguing questions because, of course, 20 or 30 years ago, the idea would have made no sense at all because people were either designated to take care of their homes or to take care of the jobs, and whichever one they weren't doing was secondary. So men helped out at home and women helped out by earning what we used to call pin money in the wage labor force. But as women have more and more entered the workforce as permanent members of the wage labor force, and as their wages have become not helping wages, but absolutely essential to running families. So in almost a third of all families now, where there are husbands and wives both earning wages, women earn more than their partners earn. On the other hand, there are, of course, millions of families where there is only one wage earner, and that wage earner is often a female. Now, here's the problem. If you're working out in the labor force, not just 40 hours a week, but 40 plus hours a week, and often commuting an hour or more each way, and you have people at home, generally small children, to take care of, how do you juggle those two things? How do you keep them in tension? Well, it used to be that if a woman earned wages, she would earn wages at a part-time job, and now she earns wages at a full-time job, and the family can't live without those wages. So the work-family tension is literally what it says. It's a tension between, I suppose you might say it's a tension in time. It involves having to make decisions about time and thinking about time as a scarce resource, and then trying to come up with a way to stretch time so that it meets the needs of both segments of one's life.
It strikes me that motherhood is sort of at the center of this time problem, this conundrum of work-family tension, both biologically speaking, as women are the only sex that can become pregnant and have to, at some level, have some kind of time off to have a child, to care for a child. And yet there are also the gendered social expectations about motherhood that presume a woman might prefer to stay home with her child, or might rather work a lower pressure, lower stress job in order to be both mother and worker. And these become entangled in very complicated ways, it seems, and yet untangling them and finding solutions to them seems to be one of the most pressing issues facing American political and sort of social movements.
It is. It's not only one of the most pressing issues, but it's the most tension-producing issues. But it's one of the most tension-producing of all the issues that men and women, or families, however they're constructed, face. And here's the problem. It used to be that motherhood was thought of as work, and that the male wage, a family wage, we used to call it, was intended to support the mother-child or the mother-children in order to make sure that children were appropriately and carefully reared. But of course, now motherhood and parenthood in general is in passing, if you like. So whereas a man was a man if he was a good provider, a woman was a woman if she was a good mother. Now those two things have absolutely overlapped and intersected with each other. And a woman, in order to be a good woman, must be both a provider and a nurturer. A man still can be a man only by being a good provider, although it's very nice if he's a nurturer. Now that situation can't continue unless we move to families that don't have male providers or don't have male carers, that is, all female families, which I don't think we're quite ready to do. There's a big problem here. And there's a piece of me that thinks that motherhood is really the issue for the next decade or two, that we will need to decide who can mother, who should mother, what it means to mother, not in terms of what the child needs, but in terms of the scarcity of time to both mother and to earn wages.
It seems to me that this tension raises questions both about the workplace and about government policy. And I want to ask about government policy first. How is it that in the United States we are still the only, what you might call major or developed, or there are other words for it, but only nation with any kind of GDP or industrial development of our size not to provide any kind of comprehensive parental leave, child care, or similar kinds of benefits for families?
Well, of course, that derives from our notion of individualism, our notion that individuals are personally responsible for themselves and for their families. So as long as a man was meant to take care of his family and a woman was not meant to be out in the workforce, providing parental leave would only encourage women to do the wrong thing, if you like. So countries like France, for example, after World War I, adopted its national creche system, which we all know so well, precisely because they needed women in the workforce. Sweden adopted its childcare policies, which were very generous after World War II, because in the 1950s they preferred to have women enter the labor force than to have immigrants do the jobs that other countries were getting done. In the United States, we assumed, not always rightly, and certainly not with respect to the poor and many African Americans, we assumed that women could not and should not be in the wage labor force, and therefore providing parental leave for those women would provide an incentive to do what the nation didn't want them to do altogether. One of the most interesting things about this is how that ideology has built up, if you like, and been perpetuated in the last 40, 50 years or so with the rise of a free market fundamentalist, anti-big government sensibility. The notion that even though we now understand that men cannot support whole families, we do not want the government interfering in family functions at all, and therefore this has been the entirely wrong time to open up the question. It's a conundrum, if you like, that just at the moment in the late 60s, throughout the 70s and 80s, when married women with children are entering the labor force at the largest rate ever, that at that point we meaning the United States, develops and begins to adhere to an ideology which argues that the government has no business supporting families, not poor families, not any kind of families. So at exactly the moment when the government should have entered the marketplace, as it were, and provided child care or provided hefty tax deductions for child care, it did the opposite. It began to withdraw its support from poor families who needed it.
And there's sort of a cruel irony here, because of course the free market promises equal rewards for equal work, perfect rationality, and yet, as you've written about in pioneering fashion, we know that a woman's wage is still a fraught social construct, and that in fact a wage gap continues to persist. Why? How does a wage gap persist in the putatively free market?
A wage gap persists because people still imagine that women and women's jobs are not worth as much as men and men's jobs are worth. A wage gap persists because occupational segregation still exists, and the majority of women are still working in jobs in which a majority of women work. And those jobs are paid less than the jobs in which men work. So, in the 70s, when the subject of comparable worth came up, instead of equal pay for equal worth, it was equal pay for jobs of comparable worth. People began doing studies that compared the amount of responsibility and skill and education required for one job or another. And they discovered that a garage attendant who was assumed to need the same skill and education as a child carer were paid at differential rates. The garage attendant was paid almost double the rate paid to the child carer. Now, how do you explain that? How do you assume that somebody who's taking care of a child can only be paid, or is only worth a half of what a garage attendant is worth? Only because in one's head, in one's imagination, the worth of a woman, the worth of caring is less than the worth of automobiles.